What if I told you that right now, millions of people are living with a debilitating condition that's so misunderstood, many of them don't even know that they have it? That condition is obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. I'm Dr. Patrick McGrath, the Chief Clinical Officer of NoCD. And in the 25 years I've been treating OCD, I've met so many people who were suffering from the condition in silence, unaware of just what it was. OCD can create overwhelming anxiety and fear around what you value most, make you question your identity, beliefs, and morals, and drive you to perform mentally and physically draining compulsions or rituals. Over my career, I've seen just how devastating OCD can be when it's left untreated. But help is available. That's where NoCD comes in. NoCD is the world's largest virtual therapy provider for obsessive compulsive disorder. Our licensed therapists are trained in exposure and response prevention therapy, a specialized treatment proven to be incredibly effective for OCD. So visit nocd.com to schedule a free 15-minute call with our team. That's nocd.com.
Instacart is on a mission to have you not leave the couch this basketball season. Because between the pre-game rituals and the post-game interviews, it can be difficult to find time for everything else. So let Instacart take care of your game day snacks or weekly restocks and get delivery in as fast as 30 minutes. Because we hear it's bad luck to be hungry on game day. So download the Instacart app today and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 orders. Service fees apply for 3 orders in 14 days, excludes restaurants.
Hello there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. This is a kind of a really quite special episode. I'm welcoming back to the podcast my good friend Toby Manning, the author of Mixing Pop and Politics, a Marxist history of pop music, who came to talk about a diverse range of topics from his book last year. We're doing this episode to mark really the passing of the extraordinary musical phenomenon that was Brian Wilson, founder of the Beach Boys and writer of some of the kind of most significant kind of contributions to the canon of 20th century pop music that you can name. Rarely would I normally do a kind of in memoriam sort of marking of someone's passing. It's not sort of what I do particularly, but Brian Wilson is such a pivotal figure in 20th century popular music that we couldn't just ignore it. So firstly, welcome again, Toby. It's lovely to see you again.
Yeah, great to be here. Nice to see you too.
Okay, and so let's dive into it and talk about Brian Wilson. So, people will often cite this kind of canon of 20th century music: Lennon and McCartney, Jagger and Richards, and Brian Wilson is kind of in that kind of constellation of these kind of fundamental figures within 20th century popular music. And I the first kind of idiot question, really, I suppose, is why? Why do we place him there? What is so significant about him?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think perhaps that needs historicizing in itself, because my hunch is that wasn't always the case. That I think if you talk to many sort of cultural commentators during the 70s and during the 80s, that he would have not been held, and the Beach Boys would have not been held in very high esteem at all.
Right.
And I feel, they had been, but I think there was a sort of sense that it was sort of pop fluff in some ways that continued the sort of also the continuation of the Beach Boys as an aggregation, mostly without Brian Wilson as a sort of touring, sort of franchise, didn't help that.
No.
But I remember very distinctly in I think in the late 80s, NME did a sort of best albums of all time thing. And Pet Sounds scored very, very highly. And I remember being quite surprised by that. And then I feel like during the 90s, that sort of the status of the Beach Boys grew and grew and grew.
Right.
I don't know. I'm not sure if I quite understand why. You might have some thoughts on that yourself, but that feels like when the sort of canonization amongst the sort of cool and hipster crowd sort
Mm.
of you know.
Well, the 1990s was this era again, and you have to kind of go slightly deeper into what the 90s was all about.
Mm,
But there was this kind of explosion in nostalgia culture in the 1990s.
mm,
People simply wouldn't shut up about ABBA. I mean, not to criticize ABBA at all. Again,
mm,
sort of part of the canon of 20th century pop music right there. And there was a kind of a resurgence in kind of fascination with and obsession with the Beatles.
mm,
And I guess it's got something to do with back catalogs, music corporations, and reissues, and there is some sort of economic sort of substrate there that kind of makes these things happen, I think, and it's generational as well. But I do remember in the 1990s, suddenly the Beach Boys, there was definitely a reappraisal there, wasn't there? Particularly of
mm.
Pet Sounds. And this is the era of Mojo magazine and things like that. This sort of kind of
So you had Mojo and Record Collector and Uncut all sort of trawling endlessly over this sort of period. Like, and yeah, I think the 60s in particular were being kind of I'd say reassessed, but in some ways they were just being kind of recuperated
yeah,
because they were sort of being that there was a sort of it was a sort of safe nostalgia that left out most of the kind of radical parts just for the sort of I guess the upbeatness and sort of positivity and stuff. And the Beach Boys sit in that reappraisal in a very interesting way, in that they come without most of the trappings of the radical 60s.
yeah,
That's quite convenient in that respect. You're not going to be, with the exception of student demonstration time, with easily one of their worst ever songs, you're not going to be kind of assailed with politics in the Beach Boys in a very direct way.
no, no,
The complexity, which I'm sure we'll come back to later, is that they don't fit with positivity at all. There's a version of the Beach Boys which you can see as positivity, which that like when I saw Brian Wilson play, the hits when he did his Sunday afternoon Glastonbury slot, I think either late 90s or early 2000s. There's a version of that, but you don't have to go very deep into the Beach Boys catalog to find a lot more kind of melancholia and anxiety that rather contradicts that sort of 60s sort of nostalgia in a way.
Well, I would say part of the beauty of Brian Wilson's songwriting is that there is this kind of longing within it, this longing for things to be different, this longing to be born in, different times, a different person, to be going home, to be with somebody else, to be somewhere else.
Mm,
And I think part of part of what kind of I think there are two things that speak to people about the Beach Boys. Firstly, there is that kind of capturing and of that kind of golden moment of kind of early 60s America, of surf and fast cars and pretty girls and all that kind of stuff. And that's a white American world. Um,
Practically Aryan.
yeah, absolutely. There was a really interesting thing in I was reading in Mike Davis and John Wiener's book, Set the Night on Fire, all about LA in the 60s. And they said, well, the reason why whiteness and surfing were kind of synonymous with one another isn't because black people didn't like surfing, it's
Mm,
because they couldn't. It's because most of there was a sort of de facto segregation
Hmm.
on Californian beaches, and so
Yeah.
it's why we assume it's a kind of a white pursuit, but not
Yeah.
necessarily.
Yeah, try turning up to a sort of California, surfer dude beach as a black guy with your surfboard. See what happens. It's like,
Yeah,
yeah, because
yeah,
then if you start talking to like, white women, just like, so yeah. I mean that to me is really fascinating. That it seems to me that like that Brian Wilson is sort of a product, very much a product of the 50s, and that the early Beach Boys are like what I call the sort of long 50s, the continuum,
yeah,
whereby a series of things have been from the 50s have been kind of rendered safe. Because I mean, we were talking about race, and what's really interesting about that is that the surf culture and California and the Beach Boys are all seen as very white, and yet it's full of black musical tropes, absolutely
mm,
full of, we're not rewriting Chuck Berry, on which one is that? What is it? Surf City, is it? I think. They are, incorporating doo-wop and stuff,
mm,
but they sort of make it sound more like barbershop, but it's still got doo-wop in
yeah,
there. So they basically and so they have this very weedy version of rock and roll, which is therefore kind of safe and unthreatening. The aggression's kind of being taken out of it. The blackness has been kind of, I don't know, whitewashed, I suppose, in some ways, but it's still there. And I feel also that the 50s rebellion is therefore taken out of rock and roll, which is happening a lot in the early 60s. So yeah, you get everything from the song that they wrote for Jan and Dean, the two girls for every guy, that sort of it's sort of everything's sort of heteronormatized, so
yeah,
there's none of the sort of ambiguity that I would argue is in Elvis, not just the sexual ambiguity is in Elvis, not just in Little Richard,
mm,
and there's songs like "Be True to Your School" and stuff. There's a sort of there's sort of cheerleader chants in these things as well. And yeah, so it's very kind of a sort of suburbanized, sort of safe, white bread version of rock and roll in the 50s.
yeah,
Um, yeah, that's how I see it. Though there are hints throughout of sort of worries and anxieties and insecurities. I mean, because they actually the thing is about the Beach Boys, there's nothing they could do to make themselves sound masculine in any conventional way,
yeah,
Because even Mike Love, like the most sort of macho and conventional of them, he does not have a masculine sounding voice,
no, no, no,
and the others, particularly Brian Wilson, whose voice is just sort of shot through with sort of yearning. It sounds, incredibly sort of feminized and sort of, anxious, yearning, even depressive. So, yeah. So those are the sort of indicators from quite early on, I think.
yeah. And then there is in the 1960s. I mean, when you have kind of like the Pet Sounds era, there is,
Hmm.
it's a really, really different kind of musical formation in a way. It's you don't hear the kind of that sort of early sort of barbershop quartet sort of sound. I mean, it's a much richer sound, and it's where you could look at Brian Wilson as being a kind of a composer, I suppose, almost with um, and not many kind of major figures in sort of pop music are you could give that title to. What happened? How do we go from sort of I Get Around to Pet Sounds? What sort of happens on that journey?
Yeah, exactly. That's a really good question because like I feel like I Get Around and Fun are like are the America's riposte to the British invasion, and they've got again they in place of rebellion they've kind of got sort of attitude, a sort of jock attitude. So it's like there's this sort of whole kind of jock culture thing that's particularly running through I Get Around, which I like, but it's really oafish. The lyrics are oafish,
Yeah,
and This is not a cool guy. Describe, he calls himself a real cool head, but to me, it's just a sort of jumped up jock kind of play acting of being rebellious, and that's all they've kind of got to sort of reject the British invasion. But in amongst that, and I think was it even the B side of "I Get Around"? Don't worry, baby. I think it might have been. Um, but don't worry, baby. To me, is the pivot. There's other indications. There's
Right.
in my room. There's let me wonder. But don't worry, baby. It's like what I find really interesting about that is it's like it always makes me think of Rebel Without a Cause. You
Mm.
know, and the way that it distills all of those anxieties that are inbuilt into the sort of post-war 50s sort of suburban perfection. The sort of anxieties about masculinity and proving yourself, sort of fear of the patriarch and of authority, worries about the future, very much and very much focus on this sort of almost like morbid and ecstatic focus on the automobile, which
Yeah.
I very much relate to. Which there's all these death songs at the time. I mean, another Brian Wilson, Janet Dean co-write Dead Man's Curve and
Good, that's
stuff.
good.
But Tell Laura I Love You and stuff. It feels like all these sort of melancholy songs about sort of automotive death, and technological morbidity must relate to the Cold War. Must relate to the sort of constant threat of sort of nuclear war that's going on. So like this sort of perfect suburban society is just underwritten and undermined
Hmm.
by this sort of cult. You
But
know,
there's a
so
lot
I
of.
kind of feel like that's all.
Oh, sorry, no, you, Toby, you carry on. Yeah.
What was I going to say?
I was going to say in the films of the kind of the Rebel Without of Cause, those sorts of films at the time, there is this sort of youth sensibility of, well, we may as well live wild today because we may not be here tomorrow. And
Yeah,
that's really
yeah,
prevalent. That kind of
yeah. I think
nihil.
that's a really,
Yeah.
and then that sort of runs through those sort of more sensitive Beach Boys songs, even of the early and mid '60s. And
Yeah.
there was, yeah, and really interesting is then how that kind of finds its sort of efflorescence in Pet Sounds. But by then, the game's moved on because, like, what I think you're seeing there is a sort of meeting, both in the mind of Brian Wilson, in the culture, and in the music. It's the meeting of that sort of long '50s sensibility with the new countercultural sensibility. And what's really striking about Pet Sounds is that it's so full of anxiety about what's happening. That's not me. I'm waiting for the day. I know there's an answer.
Yeah.
And then, and I've always sort of laughed at Caroline No as well, because it's like this sort of aching, melancholic song, which is prompted by his girlfriend cutting her hair. It's like, and that seems to be just all about anxiety about changing gender roles.
Yeah.
What's happened to sort of traditional, simpler, more straightforward gender roles. And I think that's what you hear in Brian Wilson. Both are kind of like a fascination and sort of veneration for the future and the futuristic and for change, and at the same time an anxiety about that change and what's being left behind
Mm.
and what is sort of inbuilt into him and into the culture and what will happen to that. So that seems to me like why Pet Sounds manages to sound both ecstatic and incredibly melancholic at the same time.
And I think, I mean, we talk about the 50s and the 60s, particularly the later 60s, the countercultural era, seems to be like a period of time that the Beach Boys kind of collide with and are sort of not, I don't want to say necessarily destroyed by, but kind of crushed by. I mean, you have um, Brian, who becomes really unwell for many, many years. I mean, to some, I'm always, as a work practicing therapist myself, try to kind of avoid kind of pathologizing people I haven't done work with and don't really know. But it seems that kind of cannabis use, psychosis from cannabis use is probably there, and I'm sure, and the his experience of being raised by a very authoritarian father, and I'm sure nobody becomes more mentally well when fame happens, basically. But I get the sense that he was ill-suited to the times in which he lived in, the mid-60s. And then, of course, there's everything that
I guess
happened
I just
next.
wasn't made for these times.
Yes, yes, you see how I work that in. Um,
Yeah, very good.
but I mean, were the 60s a rough time for them?
Instacart is on a mission to have you not leave the couch this basketball season. Because between the pregame rituals and the postgame interviews, it can be difficult to find time for everything else. So let Instacart take care of your game day snacks or weekly restocks and get delivery in as fast as 30 minutes. Because we hear it's bad luck to be hungry on game day. So download the Instacart app today and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 orders. Service fees apply for 3 orders in 14 days, excludes restaurants.
What if I told you that right now, millions of people are living with a debilitating condition that's so misunderstood, many of them don't even know that they have it? That condition is obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. I'm Dr. Patrick McGrath, the Chief Clinical Officer of NoCD. And in the 25 years I've been treating OCD, I've met so many people who are suffering from the condition in silence, unaware of just what it was. OCD can create overwhelming anxiety and fear around what you value most, make you question your identity, beliefs, and morals, and drive you to perform mentally and physically draining compulsions or rituals. Over my career, I've seen just how devastating OCD can be when it's left untreated. But help is available. That's where NoCD comes in. NoCD is the world's largest virtual therapy provider for obsessive compulsive disorder. Our licensed therapists are trained in exposure and response prevention therapy, a specialized treatment proven to be incredibly effective for OCD. So visit nocd.com to schedule a free 15-minute call with our team. That's nocd.com.
What do you subscribe to?
I subscribe to Multiverse Madness.
Hey, Morty. Hey, Rick.
I subscribe to Carrie's catchphrases.
Hello, lovers.
On Prime Video, I subscribe to whatever I choose. All the channels I love in one app.
I subscribe to Max.
I subscribe to Paramount Plus. Anime on Crunchyroll.
Boss is on BET Plus.
I added on Build My World. I control my scroll.
Wow. Because I choose what I subscribe to and where I do it. On Prime Video.
Rick and Morty and Just Like That, available on Max.
Or the later 60s, anyway.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So on one level, Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys sort of journey sort of proves the counterculture's conservative critics right. This is what happens when you leave the stabilities of the post-war era, and start messing around with drugs and radical ideas and different ways of living and being, But as you pointed out, what that leaves out is the sort of iron cage of the sort of authoritarian, patriarchal, socially conformist 50s that they were brought up in. So yeah, for some more than others, the liberation of the 60s was unnerving and disturbing. They couldn't cope with it. I always think it's too easy to just blame it on drugs. Drugs just seem to me to be a catalyst for other things that are probably going on in someone's mind already.
Yeah.
I call it narcotic determinism. It's just like, it's not just like, press play and the drug does its thing. It acts upon your extant mental state. So, I kind of feel that's sort of what happened there. But what's really interesting about it is that it produces such, intermittently amazing and sort of stunning music. Because, while on one level there are just, things that just seem sort of silly, that like sort of losing the plot. I mean, I would put something like Vegetables in that, in that category, to be honest, just like, but then you get something like Surf's Up. Obviously it didn't actually appear officially till sort of the 70s, but that was the centerpiece of Smile, which is when he was basically, that was when he was really losing the plot. But there's the way that they sort of take the sort of the idea of that sort of imagery and iconography of the sort of long 50s, the sort of surf and everything, and create it into this sort of Baroque, Rococo, whatever you want to call it, visionary, sort of acid infused, but just sort of alternative reality infused sort of hymn is just extraordinary. Just like that's when you feel like, there's sort of something that's being almost like a collective unconscious or something that's being sort of tapped into there.
Yeah.
That, that it's beyond kind of rational explanation. You know, you can't break down the lyrics or even the music of a song like Surf's Up into sort of rational segments. You know, and even someone like me who thinks I can reduce everything to a sort of political, analysis. You know, I'm sort of defeated by it, but that's really good, and it's in itself indicative of the sort of churn of different currents and impulses going on at that time.
With the sort of the kind of the legacy that Brian Wilson leaves, and we've talked about how historicize that and see how that has kind of changed over time. I think he was acutely aware of the importance of Lennon and McCartney and vice versa. I mean, do you
Hmm.
see them as kind of not so much contemporaries, but kind of comparable figures, really, or are they really kind of totally different animals?
No, I mean, I think what's fascinating about the 60s, we get this kind of narrative of, I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? We're always flirting with the sort of great men of history kind of,
Yeah,
approach with this very thing. And I always try to, see Brian Wilson, for instance, as a conduit of other things that are going on. So like, for instance, I almost see him as like a psychological distillation of the clash between state authority and the counterculture. Like, so
yeah,
in a way, Brian Wilson internalized what's going on in the streets where policemen and troopers are sort of cracking the heads of flower children.
yeah.
So, but so yeah, I think that, and one of I think the things that Ian MacDonald's Beatles book, The Revolution in the Head, was quite instructive for me. And again, a product of that 90s sort of, back to the 60s thing. But
Mhm.
he kept reminding us that the Beatles didn't just pluck these things out of the air or out of their own heads, that they were constantly listening to other people and incorporating ideas in a very, very conscious way. And I'm sure all the other acts of the 60s were as well. So yeah, so there was this definite dialogue going on. I mean, one of the things that particularly, I was thinking about this the other day via a circuitous route, which is I was listening to a song by the Kinks called Afternoon Tea.
Mhm.
And I thought, gosh, that's a prominent bass line for the Kinks. Can we even name the bass player in the Kinks? So can you actually, Nick? Can you name the bass player in the
I
Kinks? I certainly
know
can't.
a different Davis brother. I'm just going to guess, but no, I'm absolutely no idea.
No, it's not. It's not. I can name the drummer, Mick Avery, but I can't name the bass player. Anyway, and I thought, but you know what? It kind of sounds a bit like Getting Better or Fixing a Hole, with a sort of very off, where the bass line is playing around the beat in this very offbeat way. And of course, I learned from the Ian MacDonald book that that approach to playing the bass around the beat was derived from Brian Wilson on things like Good Vibrations as well. Yeah, and
Right.
that sort of playing around with the sort of drive of I guess of rock and roll, of pop music, is one of the things that, as you say, that sort of where instrumentation, as it were, in that case, becomes sort of becomes sort of composition and becomes like a sort of rethinking of I mean, it's quite counterculture. It's the rethinking of the rules and the way things work. And so that pulling and pushing of the bass, rather than it just landing on the bass, drum, as it were, or the beginning of the bar, is
Mm.
sort of creating this sort of being kind of pushing and pulling feeling, which is sort of slightly disconcerting, but sort of it constantly sort of opening out. Obviously, it's particularly the case of Good Vibrations, where the whole song is virtually transcendent. It's sort of, it's like almost like somebody sort of discorporating, losing their kind of
Yeah,
physical body and sort of merging with the cosmos or something, And I think then the instrumentation is very important within that, in that sort of creating that sort of, organized but sort of opening up and loosening out. So yes, that's a very long-winded answer to you. I think, yeah, very much between the two bands. Yeah.
I guess the final thing to talk about is a little bit about Dennis. I saw a documentary. I mean, I don't really want to go too much into the whole Charles Manson sort of stuff because that's very kind of done and. But as I saw it, and there was a documentary about Dennis on BBC 4 years ago. It's really, really, it was about his solo albums and his kind of decline to his untimely death. But there was an image of a concert. It was one of the post Brian kind of gigs. It must have been in the mid-70s, where the Beach Boys were just touring and touring. And obviously Dennis is a real mess by this point, and he was the really good-looking lad of the Beach Boys. You know, he was very beautiful,
Yeah, absolutely beautiful man. Yeah.
But a real mess in the 1970s. And you see, it cuts to the audience. You see all these people, and they're all in their 30s and 40s, and they're women. He's singing "You Are So Beautiful to Me," and there's this kind of generation of 30 and 40-year-old women at the front who are in tears and waving at him because he was their heartthrob. And there's something really, you see this kind of really generational moment in there of people remembering the early 60s and remembering this handsome young man. And I think part of long before we get to the nostalgia of the 90s, people were getting nostalgic for the good old days of the Beach Boys in the 70s and late 70s, perhaps even in the 1980s. And I guess in terms of historicizing the Beach Boys, this is a very long point, and I'm rambling, but in terms of historicizing the Beach Boys, we think about that 90s nostalgia moment, but that nostalgia moment had been going on really since the kind of the 1970s, and the way that people imagine the Beach Boys and the way that people engage with the Beach Boys for that generation in that gig that I saw was about remembering the best years of their lives. And is that partly kind of how we explain their, particularly in America, their enduring appeal, the remember of that kind of imaginary golden summer, so I suppose.
Hey, this is Naomi Ekperigan, co-host of the podcast Couples Therapy. I wanted to talk to you about Boost Mobile, the newest 5G network in the country. Boost Mobile's new network delivers customers the speed and service they'd expect from the big three, plus groundbreaking benefits you'd only get from a true challenger in the industry, like letting people try the network risk-free for 30 days, and offering a $25 per month unlimited plan that's guaranteed to never go up in price. So visit your nearest Boost Mobile store or find them online at boostmobile.com.
When your workforce, tech stack, and business needs are evolving all at once, you need HCM software that moves just as fast. That's why Paylocity builds what's next, providing innovative and simplified solutions for clients to tackle the real challenges they face every day. From AI-driven insights to automated workflows across HR, finance, and IT, Paylocity's platform doesn't just keep up, it leads. It's time to simplify complexity, drive results, and move forward together. Start now at paylocity.com/simplified.
Yeah, I mean, but what you're describing, there's two different things occurring there, isn't it? So what you're describing is people who kind of lived through the era who are kind of nostalgic for it, and they are no longer the obvious pop consumer, as it were, by that. Did you say it was the late 70s? Yeah.
I think so, yeah.
And
yes.
Yeah. So that's what I feel is happening. It's just like you get the sort of rise of, throughout the sort of 60s and the 70s, and particularly the 70s, you get the rise of sort of golden oldies radio, and also then the rise of sort of golden oldies tours, as it were, who were very much addressing a mom dad, demographic, and and what's important is at that time, that does not include, except, sort of in passing, the sort of the young and the hip and the sort of tastemakers. And that's what changes. So that's why in some ways, the Beach Boys are so all encompassing, because they kept the moms and dads on board for a good while through pure nostalgia. And then they added the hipsters and the cool tastemakers in the sort of 80s and 90s, Right. So it's like this kind of completely, all-consuming. Like they've got every generation and every demographic kind of gradually sucked in. It's incredible,
It's the sort of thing that someone at EMI is looking at that and salivating, basically.
Absolutely. It's like, I mean, how you make that, because the thing is, you can produce compilations, but no one's necessarily going to buy them. So it has to sort of tie into sort of shifts in culture, doesn't it? But yeah, the shift towards the back catalog obviously was a crucial part of how the record companies wanted to expand, particularly I guess when MP3s came along. But
Yeah.
even before that, there was a push towards like, sort of back catalog as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, and talking of talking of Dennis, that's also interesting because in that era when he was a rec, I'm sure you already know this,
Mm.
he was involved with Christine McVie
Yes.
of Fleetwood Mac. So there's a sort of direct, if we didn't already hear a musical connection, there's a direct, sort of biographical connection as well, and that's really fascinating that to sort of see in a way the sort of torch being passed, in the late 70s to Fleetwood Mac as the sort of, the distillation of sort of West Coast rock, but again with that sort of yearning and sort of sometimes neurosis and that mix of ecstasy and sort of melancholy, in there as well. So it's very interesting that sort of continuity there.
Cool. Well, there we must leave it. And thank you, firstly, thank you so much, because I reached out to Toby the other week just to say on the off chance, do you want to come along and talk about Brian? So I'm hugely grateful you've been able to make the time, and you've been a bit under the weather, and so I'm very, very appreciative of that. The next time, when Elton goes, let's do that one, shall we? Not to be morbid.
I mean, I
Okay.
guess we just have to face up to these things. This is just going to be an endless sort of string of these, but obviously I'm in denial.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Well, thanks so much, Toby, and I'll let you go, and we shall chat again, no doubt.
Fantastic. Really enjoyed it. Thanks, Nick.
Cheers.
At Capella University, you can learn at your own pace with our FlexPath learning format. Take 1 or 2 courses at a time and complete as many as you can in a 12-week billing session. With FlexPath, you can finish the bachelor's degree you started in 19 months and under $19,000. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu. Fastest 25% of students. Cost varies by PACE, transfer credits, and other factors. Fees apply.
You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other job sites. With Indeed sponsored jobs, your post jumps to the top of the page for your relevant candidates, so you can reach the people you want faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed have 45% more applications than non-sponsored jobs. Don't wait any longer. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/PODKATZ13. Just go to Indeed.com/PODKATZ13 right now. And support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need.